Thank you, Kayla, and welcome everybody to NOCO. We're really happy to be able to present what we've been doing over this last year. For those of you that have heard about hemp saving the planet for decades, right? There's a lot of hempsters that have been talking about that for a long, long time, ever since Jack Herer in 1985. I hope that this will be good information for you because bottom line, we've got to ask the question, okay, if that's true, what are the numbers? Show us the numbers, right? So that we can take it to the powers that be and make sure that hemp is being considered as strongly as some of these other measures that are being funded right now by the US government, by the UN, et cetera. For those of you that are listening to this recording afterwards that may not be familiar with hemp, hopefully you'll see the value of some of these numbers. And if you're a government official or someone who doles out money to help address the climate crisis problems, you'll see that this is a viable and very important natural resource that can help us survive as a inhabitable planet and species. So with that, let me just jump in and give you the bad news, but I think all of you already know what it is. The IPCC has made it very clear that we have a very limited amount of time to address the climate crisis issue. In fact, they said a couple years ago that we only had until 2030, and they have not changed that stance, and that we need to reduce our emissions by 45% by that time frame. And if we don't, we may end up with a runaway train, tipping points in the climate crisis that we cannot recover from. It could just get worse and worse and worse, and there may be nothing that we can do about it. So if you're concerned about that, and I assume everybody in this room is, we have to do something. We have to do something quickly. We need something like this now. Just prior to the Second World War, FDR initiated a wartime mobilization to prepare the nation to enter into that war. He had an extreme sense of urgency about doing this, and he was out to engage all possible resources to make things happen. If someone was making cars like Henry Ford, he was asked to make B-24 bombers. And cost was not the number one consideration. Usually if you're trying to bring some sort of a product into market, you have to figure out how it's going to be better, faster, cheaper, et cetera. But this is a resource that we can use to address the climate crisis right now, immediately. And that's why it's so important. So another part of this thing with the wartime mobilization is that our leaders have to engage those people that they may not necessarily like that much. Back in these days, Henry Ford absolutely hated FDR. He thought he was a socialist and all that good stuff, right? But it turned out FDR was right. And if he hadn't done his wartime mobilization, we'd all be speaking German right now or Japanese, which would be fine, nothing wrong with that. By the end of this wartime mobilization, by the way, Henry Ford was not making any cars whatsoever, but he was pumping out B-24s at a rate of one every 63 minutes out of the Willow Run facility there. Just an incredible thing. We came to the crisis and we met it head on, and we succeeded. And that's what we have to do again. Let's take a look at some of the measures that we're currently looking at as a society around the world to address this crisis. Electrification. Goodness, let's make this thing happen. We have to have electrification on a wide-scale basis. And from what I read, by the end of the century or maybe earlier, we're going to have to spend something on the order of about 1.5% of our national GDP in order to get there. That's actually a little less than the wartime mobilization from World War II. But we've got to get to the point where we have about an electric grid that's about 4 times the size of what we currently have now. Steve, come up here, man. We're waiting on you. Get up here. Mark is also on the team, but he can't come up because he's manning the video over there. So, but net, as you can see here, as hard as we try, we're still going to have a big challenge, especially over the next 8 years. In fact, the fossil fuels aren't going to be any less, and the use of fossil fuels aren't going to be less within that time frame. So we need something more on an immediate time frame. Second one is reforestation. Hallelujah for reforestation. It's a great idea, but the U.S. government back in 1914 made it very clear there's a plant that grows biomass 4.1 times faster. Deb Sterling. Deb, could you join us? I didn't see you out there. Thank you. So if we're really thinking about planting something on a long-term basis, we all know a forest can take decades to come to maturity. It's going to be absorbing a lot of CO2 during that time, et cetera. But you can actually get 4 times more biomass. So of those areas that are able to be cultivated, that are being considered for reforestation, let's think about cultivating them and raising hemp there instead of doing trees. It's simply a waste of time to grow something slowly, right, on these lands. So not all the lands obviously will be cultivatable, but we have to take a look at a study and try to figure out which ones would work, which ones wouldn't. Bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration. This is an interesting measure that's being experimented in the UK right now. At least they're looking at the idea here of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere into trees, and then cutting down the trees, making tiny little rabbit pellets out of them, and then burning that, and then hopefully capturing the CO2 out of it. This hasn't worked out too terribly well for them. The UK apparently ran out of enough trees, and they had to import them now from Canada, right? And with burning all that diesel on ships, et cetera, we'll see how well this plays out. Direct air capture, really interesting technology. It's kind of strange that humans always think they have to create some sort of a new machine in order to address a problem, right? And that's what they're doing here. You can't patent a plant, has been the thought for many decades. That's starting to change now, but the idea here is to use a man-made machine, a bunch of them, and they're going to be very expensive. I hope it works. We need every single measure that we can make work out there. But the idea of taking CO2 out of ambient air is quite a challenge. And as you can see from the bottom of the slide here, it's only going to start to ramp in 2030. So it's not going to address what we need to do right now. Next one is soil sequestration. Everybody's getting high on this idea of soil sequestration, and it's great. It's wonderful. As you can see, it has the opportunity here. I wasn't pointing this out before, but it has an opportunity by 2050, just like the previous measure, to be taking to draw down a little less than 5 gigatons of CO2 per year, and it's inexpensive, $0 to $100. All you're really doing is keeping, I'm sure there's plenty of you that know a lot more about this than I do, but you're keeping the soil alive, right? And it's always it's always pulling in more CO2 as a result. So it's a great thing, and hemp is going to play a role in this as well, as I'll show you in a second. Biochar. Man, we just competed for an X Prize contest recently, and it looked like everybody was submitting some sort of a biochar, right, concept. It's super hot area. Again, they're looking, according to this one source, co2removal.org, they're looking at saying that there will be about 2 gigatons of CO2 that's going to be pulled down by 2050 every year. I think that number is a little higher. That's why I highlighted that. I think it's got more potential than that. But the cost is very effective at $30 to $120 per ton of CO2 removed out of the atmosphere. One of the big challenges here with biochar, one of our members is Dr. Paul Anderson. He's the co-author with Mr. McLaughlin of a book that's widely read in this biochar industry. And I think the title is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's All Biochars Are Not Created Equal. Yeah, and that's very, very, very true and very important. We'll touch on that in a bit. And then there's industrial hemp. And as we know, anybody that's ever read Jack Herer's book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, and many other books since that time, hemp can be used in many different ways. But today, the things that it can be used for are expanding with all these new technologies. Let's take a look at what we're looking at right now. So this was the genesis, was realizing that we had this challenge upon our hands. And about a year ago, it was probably a year ago this week at NOCO, Steve Heising here, Steve, and I kind of brainstormed the idea, why don't we try to put together a team that would figure out how hemp could be considered one of the most important resources on the planet to address the climate crisis. And so our subsequent mission statement is Drawdown Hemp is a think tank focused on quantifying and creating awareness of industrial hemp, right? A lot of people still don't understand what industrial hemp is. They think it's either CBD or marijuana. We all know it's the same plant grown a different way, different genetics, et cetera, but the idea here is to promote it as a leading resource to immediately address the climate crisis. To that effect, this is the team that regularly meets once a week or so, which Kayla has played a part in many times, by the way.
I just listen.
Yeah.
You guys work so hard.
Thanks. What's amazing about this team is it's an all-volunteer team. And to get this much effort done and this much work done, I feel blessed, and I want to thank all of you. Thank you so much. And if I can, I just want to introduce some of the team members. I'm getting all overclumped here. Jeremy Hale.
Hello.
Jacek Miliuski, who could not make it. Carl Martel, who could not make it. Paul Anderson, who could not make it. Sandra and Daryl Huddleston.
Yes.
Deb Sterling, who's our counsel at large. And Klaus Eleveld out of Europe. Tracy Fielding. Eric Osterman with Heartland. Mark Steele, who's helps us with all video and websites, etc. Glenn Donahoe out of France. Tony DeVira with, what's the name of that organization? Rodale Institute, yes. Jane Burns Leverens, myself, and again, Steve, and last but not least, I have to mention Steve again. Steve Heising and Mandy Kerr, who, if it wasn't for them and Global Hemp Association, we would not have met and come together as a team. So that's where it all gelled, Global Hemp Association. I can't say enough good things about them. And finally, one special thanks to my buddy Ted Mazzino, who's in, there he is. Thank you, Ted. He's been a kind of a personal sponsor for me to help me with, financially with projects like building the first production hemp car and putting together, re-putting together and re-editing and publishing The Emperor Wears No Clothes, which we did 2 years ago. So thank you, Ted. You're my buddy. Some of the inspiration behind Drawdown Hemp comes from a couple different guys. The one who's mentioned in all 3 of these books is Henry Ford. As you guys probably know, I built a hemp car a couple years back, and it got a lot of press and was on Jay Leno's garage. So I kind of looked into Henry Ford. But Henry Ford, later in life, got to be really good friends with George Washington Carver. And the two of them brainstormed all the time about how they could make everything possible from plant materials. They were part of a movement called Chemergy. That was kind of late in life for him. And then after he knew Carver is when he made his soybean hemp plastic car, whatever you want to call it. Earlier in life, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were really great pals. And they, right around 1917, they used to travel around the countryside just probably to promote the Model T and taking little vacations and this sort of stuff. But interestingly enough, the two of them have been pictured many times at grain mills with these water wheels to power these facilities. And their idea, Henry Ford's idea, was to not only make everything possible from plant material, from crops, but actually make the products right there in what were called village industries. So he had a formula, a massive 5 horsepower coming from these water wheels per employee at these little facilities. And he actually created the first carbon negative manufacturing facilities in the world, which is interesting. And the third book, which inspired me when I read it years ago, was, of course, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. In case anybody wants to, these are the QR codes if you want to pick up copies of these books. They're great books. But it had this story about Henry Ford and the car that he made, and many other great stories about the history of hemp. Industrial hemp primarily is what he was concerned with. And finally, there's the book Drawdown, and that was the clincher for us, right? In 2013, Project Drawdown was sponsored by a gentleman by the name of Paul Hawken. If you ever get a chance to watch some of his videos, he's just an awesome visionary. But he set out to get 100 different solutions to the climate crisis, not only for carbon sequestration, but also for carbon avoidance, right? And he came up with 83 different solutions, and he quantified them all. And he went in detail with these groups. He had tremendous following of people. And they figured out basically the LCAs for all these different measures that could be taken, and they ranged all over the place in terms of how effective they might be. But at the very end of the book, I noticed when I was reading it, they said, you know, industrial hemp might be important too, right? So that was going to be a coming attraction. But you have to think back in 2013 when he started, industrial hemp was still considered as dangerous as heroin, even though it can't get you high at all.
And you can
So,
import it from Canada, you just can't, it's just dangerous if you grow it.
yeah, you get arrested or something. So net, they said that they were going to come back and do an in-depth study about hemp, but they didn't. And I reached out to them 3 times, never heard back from them. Wonderful organization, but somebody had to actually document what hemp's capabilities were, and so that was what got us to the point of doing what we did. So we asked, how are we going to quantify it? Why should we quantify hemp? Well, the first one, I want to get back to this point, is urgency. We have 8 years. If we don't do something now, and if our leaders don't do something now, we could be in a heck of a problem. So we're investigating both potential ways to sequester and avoid gigatons of atmospheric CO2 per year. The second one is versatility. Hemp, as you know, is able to be used for a number of different products, and we're going to go through that here in a second. The third one is that we share a vision that in the decades to come, the whole idea of making everything from plant materials is going to be commonplace. No matter what we do over the next decade or maybe 2 decades, we're still not going to take out all of the CO2 that we need to get back to a sub 300 parts per million environment. So we're going to have to continue to make things out of stuff that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. You might as well do it. You got to build a house. You might as well make it out of hempcrete, right? Same sort of thing. You got to use materials. At least you should make sure that they're carbon negative materials. Consistency. This is a really big point, right? Getting back to what Paul said, that all biochars are not created equal. As manufacturers get into the groove of making their products out of crops and plant materials, they're usually not always located in just one location. They might have a facility in Nome, Alaska, and another one down in Puerto Rico or something like that. And they need to have a feedstock for those materials that's relatively consistent. And the beauty of hemp is that it can grow in so many different places. Bamboo is wonderful stuff. Doesn't grow everywhere, right? But hemp, I mean, with the additional studies and scientific efforts that are happening right now with hemp, I think we'll have strains that will be able to give us some repeatability for manufacturers to use anywhere around the world. So, food friendly, this is a big point. When we talk about using plant materials, et cetera, to address all sorts of problems here, from fuels to making building materials, one of the big concerns that people usually have is that going to take away from our food supply? Is it going to compete with food? That was the big argument against corn for ethanol, which turned out to be kind of a not such a great a thing. But net, as you guys know, being hemp enthusiasts, the hemp grain is one of the healthiest foods you can possibly eat, high in omegas, and it actually has more protein in it in a pound of hemp grain than a pound of beef. So we can offset that and continue. So most of the solutions you're going to see here today assume that what is used for the feedstock is a dual-purpose crop, right? Not necessarily planted super dense. Sometimes it would be, but the correct density so that it would also yield hemp grain, and then you have the stalk that would be used as a residual for a lot of these applications. This one's a big one, right? ESG. You look at a lot of the competition that's going on right now with the government. They're waking up. They want to get the underrepresented populations out there, the poor farmers, et cetera, who have been passed by with giant ag, and they want to have them included in all these competitions. And this is really important. Think about this, right? Not only can hemp be grown and processed all around the United States and other places, but all around the world, from small villages, right, in the middle of the jungle or something like that. And it's going to allow people to have their own source of revenues and their own food and their own clothing, their own building materials, their own prosperity, and their own self-reliance. This is a huge part that hemp can do and do very well. And then the last one is multiple carbon credits. I did a presentation a while back at GHA, and we talked about the fact that soil sequestration is likely to be better with hemp than regular corn or something else, soybeans or what have you, simply because you've got the root stock goes down as much as 2 meters and breaks up the soil. So you have a much deeper environment of healthy soils, excuse me.
If anybody wants to get into that, that video is available on our YouTube, on our public YouTube, available to view the interview that Bruce was referencing.
Well, thanks. Yeah, so we're probably going to hemp is probably going to yield a better than average soil sequestration. So there's a credit. The second one of the trifecta, I like to call it, is the sequestration into products. So if you put it into a durable good that lasts over 100 years, hooray. If you sequester it into other types of products, even if you put it into the soil as a very high quality biochar, it's going to stay there for 1,000 years or more. So you get that credit. And the third potential is to make your product out of hemp instead of making it out of stuff that's petroleum based or required petroleum, massive amounts of petroleum in order to heat up that iron ore or something like that, or the limestone or what have you. So you can make your products out of material that doesn't require nearly as much fossil fuels. So I call it the trifecta. People are out, there's a lot of people in the finance world that are looking for areas that they can get multiple carbon credits, and hemp just shines with this regard. So this is some of the conclusions that we've come to over the last year, and I just want to start to talk about this with a few caveats, right? Number one, these are cursory findings. We do not have a huge budget to do full LCAs on this stuff. What we're trying to do is find out where the big hits are, right? So don't take these numbers to the bank, right, because they have not been researched at that level. We're just trying to find out what ones make the most sense, so then we can go to government entities that might give grants, et cetera, and say, let's take a look at this one in more depth. We need to know exactly what the LCA is. We need to know what the land requirements are. We need to know, yeah, these are the possibilities. So this has been a really great eye-opener here. And I'm going to go through some of these things. The other thing is that this is a logarithmic chart, okay? Some things like hemp fuel, as an example, are so much, the number is so much bigger. The only way to see everything on one chart is to do it in a logarithmic scale. Otherwise, a lot of the stuff would look pretty small. Okay, so you can see 10 million tons per year is 1/10 of 100 million. It's 1/10 of 1 gigaton, and as you can see. But let me start over here on the right-hand side. These two right here. Okay, in terms of urgency, take a look at biochar, hemp biochar, by the way, not just any biochar, but hemp biochar added to cropland, right? And then hemp biochar added to abandoned croplands. Just those two alone, if we did that in a very fast time frame, I'm saying this particular analysis is over a decade, which might not be possible. Maybe it'd take 15 years, but a concerted effort, right? We all know that the croplands around the world are depleted of carbon content, and they need a boost. And this is a way that we can stick in about 2 gigatons of CO2 per year into the soil, and it's sequestered for over 1,000 years. Man, that's what we've got to do, and we can get it done if we realize that we are under a time constraint here. It has to be done quickly. So one point I want to make about this, by the way, again, back to Paul Anderson's point, not all biochars are created equal. Because the hemp stalk grows so fast and so abundantly, it has these micropores and macropores that make it absolutely fantastic when it comes to retaining water or holding some sort of a organic fertilizer that you may want to pre-impregnate it with before you put it into the fields. So it's considerably different than, say, chicken poop or what have you. You want to have something that's very consistent, performs very well, and we already know that hemp performs extremely well as a biochar. So let me move on to another one here. I can kind of go through some of these things. Don't ask me, please, about anaerobic digestion. That's Yasek's world, and I don't know anything about that. So I'm going to move right over to phytoremediation. There's ample opportunities to fix many of these lands, especially the ones we really looked at were here in the United States. There are a lot of lands that have been dumped on by military bases and commercial production and then just abandoned afterwards. And hemp, as we all know, even back to the days of Chernobyl, is great at cleaning up these contaminated soils. And by the way, for the the Native American tribes and the first American tribes as well, unfortunately, they have been the victims of a lot of this land pollution, and they have tremendous opportunity to clear up some of their lands and make them useful again. But you can see there again, that's like 100 million tons that are able to be pulled out. I can't remember exactly what the amount of years that we estimated that would be offhand. Then I want to point out this next one here, and we can answer those things offline, and I've got some of the team members here too who ask questions of. This one to the far right here, this one came up about 2 months ago. I was on Air Miners and watching what they were, one of their presentations, a bunch of biochar guys on there, right? And they weren't necessarily hemp. I'm there with my drawdown hemp thing behind my head, and on the Zoom call, and everybody's wondering, why are you guys here talking about hemp? What does hemp have to do with saving the planet? But these guys did a very good presentation on something called biomass harvesting and sequestration. And the whole idea is if you grow trees and cut them down and you dig a huge pit, you can fill this pit, I mean really huge, like a Grand Canyon pit is what they were showing, with these giant earth movers, et cetera, on that kind of a scale. If you bury them deep, if you bury those trees deep enough, they won't decompose, or they'll decompose so slowly that it won't be a problem. And I raised my hand and said, well, if you're going to raise a bunch of trees and bury them, why not raise something that grows 4 times faster if that's all you're going to do with it? And they're going like, well, that's kind of a good point. Not that I think that this would be something that we would all get behind, the idea of burying perfectly good hemp stalks, but we're in a pinch, so it's something that we should put out there and just say, gosh, if anybody really gets excited about the idea of burying trees, we ought to turn their head around and say, let's bury hemp instead. But again, that's not a real popular idea with the team. I remember Steve going like, what the heck are you talking about? But it's interesting. Some of the other areas that we are looking to investigate are biochar as a feed, livestock feed, and just regular the chopped hemp as well and seed as a feed. We haven't had time to look at that yet. Hemp textiles, of course, is something we want to work with. I was talking to Barbara Philippone and the Summer Star last night about seeing if we can work with them and try to get some numbers. As you probably know, about 6 or 7% of man-made GHGs come from the textile industry. And if we can produce hemp clothing like this without all the toxic materials and this sort of thing, then we'll be better off. We're going to look at batteries, we're going to look at paper, we're going to look at hemp wood. Carbon black is the stuff that car tires are made out of, and that can be made out of biochar as well, hemp biochar. Plastics, this is about 20 to 25% of plastics right now can be replaced with hemp stalk material, not necessarily biochar, could be biochar as well. Woven hemp biocomposites. This is an area that I'm personally interested in this next generation of material. It's called CNF. NCF is half the weight of the hemp biocomposite that I use to make the car. And so I'm hopefully going to be getting back into that this next year. It's a replacement for carbon fiber and fiberglass, yes. Yeah. It's much lighter than fiberglass. And instead of dumping 22 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere by using carbon fiber, for every pound that you used, you're going to be actually taking about 2 pounds of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the difference in terms of environmental contribution is tremendous. Carbon fiber is pretty bad stuff from an ecological standpoint. Moving over here, there's 3 different building materials we're not at liberty to talk about right now. We call them Project A, Project B, and Project C. But when we can, because we're talking with some companies, right? And they may not want to have that out. But each one of them represent a really big chunk, upwards of a gigaton per year. Remember, some of these things we were talking about before, we're only saying that they're going to be able to do 2 to 5 gigatons per year, and we're starting to bounce up against that area right now. Hemp rebar, we just added this last week. Really interesting. This is something that I was going to develop about 2 years ago, and it just didn't have the time. But as you can see, you get 2 of those credits in that because you're no longer using steel, right? And that's about 59% recycled steel, by the way, for rebar typically. But now you're using hemp instead and bioepoxies and sequestering CO2. And to Steve's point, the big benefit which we haven't quantified on this, is the fact that concrete buildings, can last up to 3 times as long if they don't have steel rebar in them that rusts and eventually makes the buildings fail. So there's a huge avoidance opportunity there and can change construction. One of the first things we thought we were going to find was that hempcrete would be one of the biggest contributors here for carbon sequestration, and it was a pretty big one. These numbers, both hemp blocks, hempcrete, and hemp biochar blocks, are all big numbers, and they can make a big dent, but they represent basically making every single building around the world with those materials, and which isn't likely, but those are the numbers that we came up with. So we were fascinated to find some of these other things that would be bigger. And then there's taking care of the well plugging from the petroleum industries. And we've only done one of the 3 analysis so far, and that was hempcrete into well plugging. great application. The U.S. government's putting up $1 billion right now. I hope somebody's going after this market to address that. And then the last one is hemp fuel. And this one is just a kind of a placeholder in the analysis right now. Electrification is going to bring down the need for fossil fuels, not fast enough, and there will be a space for hemp diesel from hemp grain, and we'll see where it can apply. But obviously, if you added all these things together, you would not have enough land mass in the world to do all of this stuff. But you will be adding a lot of land mass here because of what you've done here. You'll be adding more land mass here because of what you have here. And here's one last area where we can add more land mass, and that's to introduce hemp seed instead to replace beef, which is probably not going to go over well with a lot of people. I'm looking forward to a nice steak myself tonight, but it's something that may happen anyway, whether they like it or not. There's there's precision fermentation, lab-grown meat, which is coming on strong, and some people will say that it will replace most meats in the next decade. Could be wild. It could be your next cheeseburger, or in 15 years, your next cheeseburger could be $100. Who knows? Or hemp-fed. So yeah, you could either. Yeah, that's another point too. So, but if you take a look at all the land mass right now that's used to raise cattle around the world, and you add it all up together, right? It's not all necessarily cultivatable, right? A lot of it wouldn't be, but it's equivalent to the United States, Australia, and China. So when people say, well, I don't think we're going to have enough land mass to grow plant material to make everything we need, that may change. So. Bottom line is we have an opportunity here to use this incredibly versatile plant to address the largest challenge humanity has ever faced. And I have to say, we have to do this. So if President Biden, if you're listening to this recording in the future, hemp has been there before. It's been there for each one of the wars that we've had since the inception of our country. It was critical, and it was used all the way up until World War II, and it can be there and mobilized for us to be a big win again. So we need to mobilize this decade. It's critical. Funds and studies and pilots are required to take the kind of work we're doing and go bring it to the next step. We need to incentivize all these corporations to make things out of crop materials like hemp. And finally, President Biden, I just want to remind you that, just like FDR, he worked things out with Henry Ford, you can work things out with Mitch McConnell. This is the guy that passed the Farm Bill in 2018, and I suspect because he wanted to get farmers growing industrial hemp or some sort of hemp in Kentucky where it grows very well, I suspect that he would be pleased to find out that if we could grow more hemp, especially of the industrial variety, he would be happy to go along with the program. Let's hope. So that's it. We do meet at every Saturday morning at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. If you'd like to join in, just visit us at drawdownhemp.org and shoot us an email. And if you're from a philanthropic organization and you want to get behind these studies and help fund us, right now we've been without any funding whatsoever, and that's why these people are so skinny back here.
We don't feed you guys.
Yeah. So we would welcome your support. So at that, take any questions with any time that we might still have, and we have our panelists here.
I think we have time for one question.
Questions, anybody? I answered all the questions, all within that time frame?
Are any of those guys going to say anything? They look really cute up there, but I was just kind of wondering.
No,
Look at
they're actually decorations.
We initially looked at the world of hemp-free building houses that don't rot when they get wet and they don't burn when the fire comes through. And we look at towns like Paradise, California, that lost 14,000 homes. And that was 3 years ago, and they've only started building back maybe 1,000. And if you're gonna build it back, don't you wanna build it back with something that doesn't burn down next time?
Build it back
Start
greener.
looking at how can we go further?
Carbon
and make
negative.
the house negative carbon.
Yeah.
We can make the hempcrete negative, so we can make the foundation negative, we can make the render negative, we can make the roofing negative, we can, each house we build could be minus 25 tons of carbon. And right now, they're plus 25 tons. That's 50 tons per house. And we're not gonna stop building. People are gonna be flooded, they gotta move, they gotta live somewhere. And so the hempcrete is interesting, but we looked at, there's 30 million acres of corn grown for ethanol, maybe more right now. And the funny thing is, electric cars don't need gasoline or ethanol, so we've got 30 million acres to work with. And nobody has to change anything except put the right seed in the ground. And so we think the future is bright, but we gotta get on it. Because if we wait another 10 years, we may be too late.
Well, there's biobutanol projects going right now that are drop-in replacements for ethanol, and they can be made from any agricultural base. But hemp is the optimum product because it's obviously carbon negative. But they're using the C5 and C6 sugar chains to create the biobutanol product and then separating the water off. So they're just looking for their final round of funding, and we're gonna have biobutanol being produced in this country out of hemp.
That's what I ran in my hemp car, is biobutanol.
It's coming, so, yeah, awesome. Any quick last minute questions?
No, I did get that chart that was, I had to move up here because I'm old and I couldn't see it back there.
I can't see it from here myself, I was faking it.
Is your chart with just those, is it here at Drawdown Hemp, that chart?
Yes. Well, we haven't published it yet, but once Mark gets a hold of the videos and does his thing, we'll have all of this, what we just presented on site. Thank you.
We're
Thanks for
trying to
coming.
be a little stealthy because there's 3,000 teams competing for the Expo with a $50 million top prize. We heard that Elon Musk just bought 30,000 acres of land to grow industrial hemp on. We have other hemp teams, we have other biochar teams, and we can't tell you everything yet. But stay tuned, Earth Day will be big, maybe. We'll have the announcement.
Well, thank you, Drawdown team, we appreciate it.
Thank you all.